turning toward the topic for today, I want to acknowledge that this moment in the Twin Cities in 2020, we are profoundly aware of the racial inequalities that were painfully evident this summer. Black, Indigenous, and people of color face greater risks of dying and severe complications due to the COVID-19 virus. And shockingly, this circumstance is a testament to a society that fails to support Black, Indigenous, and people of color in the same way and to the same degree as white people. This is further evident in the economic disparities we see between white people and people of color. I'm going to review those in just a moment, but I want to give you a sense of what's going to come in the time that we have together, what will unfold. And so the remaining time that I have today will be devoted to documenting the scale of racial disparities in homeownership, exploring how these disparities came to be so persistent, thinking about some of the contemporary effects from past decisions. And then I'll also touch on what we can do in response. And so I'll have a point about halfway, I should say a half hour in, that will allow for us to do some clarifying questions. But otherwise, if you have more substantive questions, please hold those to the end and we'll tackle those as they come. So as conversations in public policy and popular press have noted the past several years, the Twin Cities see some alarming disparities between white and non-white groups, especially Black and Latinx groups. And the next graph that I'll show you, I think, illustrates this pretty vividly. So here we end up seeing at least tracking median household income. Again, that means it is 50% below, 50% above for that group. So it's not an average, it's a median. And when we compare those medians, we can see that there's a pretty stark difference between the white non-Hispanic and many other groups of color. There's just a slight difference between white non-Hispanic and Asian, but you can see that there's a sizable difference between other groups. And now the rates, when we look at homeownership rates and some of these other measures, the rates are higher in the Twin Cities than in other metropolitan areas. And moreover, such disparities are evident across a number of facets of the life experience, including educational achievement, income, policing outcomes, criminal justice, and homeownership. To be sure, these are all interconnected. And in my time with you today, I want to focus on housing and the systems that influence homeownership. It's something that's near and dear to your work. And I think in part, I'm interested in this because these play, the access to housing plays a foundational role in driving racial disparities of the kind that we just reviewed in income. And so we can here just kind of look at the graph that's before you. This is different from the income. This is homeownership rate. And again, it's tracking those measures over a 5-year period. It's the most recent data that we have. And as you can see, in the Twin Cities 7-county region, there is a noticeable difference in homeownership rates. Above 75% for white non-Hispanic, and for other groups, it's in the 30s, maybe across 40%, with an exception being people who identify as Asian. So access to stable housing is itself an important part of our everyday life. Housing provides shelter, a place to feel rooted, and also contributes to personal health and well-being. It gives us access to education, the ability to vote, and a claim to being part of something bigger than ourselves, something like a community. And as sociologist Matthew Desmond observes in his best-selling book, Evicted, without a home, everything else falls apart. This is so perhaps because the world operates as if it expects everyone to have stable housing, and it punishes people who don't. So I'm going to build on this point by looking specifically at homeownership and how that contributes to racial disparities. So we can see in this graph here, just looking at the home ownership gap. And so this is the gap between white non-Hispanic and non-white groups. And it's a summary measure. And so it's tracking what that difference is. And so you can see, it's beginning about 20 years ago. And it's tracking that discrepancy, that difference. It's been fairly steady here in the Twin Cities, and really steady in the rest of the United States overall. We can actually see that there was a bit of a shift sort of after the Great Recession. That's come down a bit in recent years. But so there's this discrepancy of about 35% that's been steady. I think that's important to note. It's important to note that the Twin Cities is higher compared to other metropolitan areas. So homeownership has, for the last 80 years or so in America, been a powerful vehicle for building wealth. I'm sure you know this. And as you also know, through owning a home, people build equity, which they can draw on to finance education, cover health bills, buy up to bigger, larger housing, perhaps something that is a bit more premium, and overall improve their family's life chances and their family's economic mobility. So homeowners can deduct interest on their mortgage from their taxable income. I'm sure you know this. And what this means is that they often pay a lower tax rate. These are some of the reasons why homeownership has been called a wealth escalator. And this graph here illustrates that there's considerable racial disparity in homeownership in the US, and it's especially pronounced here in the Twin Cities. So thinking about a key message that I want you to hold on to and to leave with, I want to relay to you today that communities of color in America have historically been denied opportunities of homeownership. They've been systematically cheated and taken advantage of. And this has disadvantaged them and limited their ability to get on that wealth escalator. This is a result of institutional racism in housing policy. Institutional racism is defined as policies, practices, and procedures that work to disadvantage racialized groups and support dominant groups. And these can often work in subtle ways, ways that aren't immediately recognizable to the participants in the system. And this is different from individual racism that results from racial animus, that might be a deliberate kind of mean-spirited prejudice or discriminatory treatment. So institutional racism highlights how the operating system, if you will, the policies and the practices of a government program, of a workplace, of a school, and so on, routinely produce unequal or unjust outcomes for people of color. And institutional racism in housing access has led to today's disparity wealth. For instance, according to the Minneapolis Federal Reserve Bank, in 2016, the median accumulated wealth of a white household in the Twin Cities was $140,000, whereas the median wealth of a Black household in the Twin Cities was about $15,000. Right? That's 1/9 the value of a white household. Now, what do we mean by wealth? So wealth, I would say, is a more telling measure of economic stature, since it considers income and expenditures, as well as the value of savings and assets and debts that individuals accumulate over time. This graphic here from a website called Sojourners, I think gives us a quick but detailed formula for thinking about what wealth represents. And it's different than income. Right? And sometimes there is not a clear correlation between one's income and one's wealth, often in part because wealth can be passed down through generations, or the wealth itself can be locked up in the value of the assets that a person holds that isn't necessarily flowing into an annual income. And so wealth is that balance between assets, the value of your assets, and the value of your debt. And the Institute for Policy Studies used a more conservative way to calculate wealth, in part because, what's noted here in this et cetera is oftentimes durable goods are included, such as, even things that depreciate. So the value of furniture and automobiles are often considered in wealth. And so the Institute for Policy Studies actually set aside the value of those durable goods, such as furniture or car. And they came to a different, really more alarming outcome when they looked at wealth differentials. Right? And they were doing this work in 2016. So the median Black family, this is in the United States, had a net wealth of $1,700. The median Latinx family had a net wealth of $2,000. Compare that with the median white family, $116,000 net wealth. That difference is staggering to me. Research from the Urban Institute shows that this gap has increased since 1983. You can track it here on these two graphs that compare white to Black household or families and white to white non-Hispanic families. And you can see that there was certainly an increase until about 1983, and then we see this up and down picture for both Black and non-white Hispanic families. And certainly there's up and down picture for white families, but the divergence between these are increasing, right? They are increasing in noticeable ways. And so moreover, it's important to note that these are national trends and they can diverge even greater at the local level. A 2015 study in Boston found that the wealth of the median white family was $247,500, while the wealth of the median Black family in Boston was $8. You heard me correctly, $8. So in Minneapolis, we can see how the systemic shock of the Great Recession affects everyone. So though the foreclosure crisis, the loss of homeownership was geographically concentrated in affected neighborhoods with a majority people of color to a greater degree. So this map on the left is a map from the University of Minnesota, one of their research centers, that is showing the percent non-white population essentially by block group area. So these really granular kind of geographies in the city of Minneapolis. And you can see here that there are particular concentrations of white people and particular concentrations of non-white people in the city in some areas that are more mixed. And if you compare that with the map on the right, you can also begin to see that there are clusterings of foreclosures as measured in 2009. And these correlate, right? These correlate with where people of color are residing. And one thing to note in this presentation, because I'm unapologetically a geographer, there'll be a lot of maps, a lot of graphics. So this is the first of several installments that you'll end up seeing. Now, the longer term effects of this are that these harder hit racial minority neighborhoods have not seen property values recover, but instead the cycle of decline is still evident. So we can see this in looking at the property value assessments in Minneapolis. Most property in the city appreciated since 2010. But look at what happened. Values still declined in predominantly non-white neighborhoods. Specifically, we can see that in the north side, North Minneapolis. Right? And we're seeing a mix of both depreciating value and tax delinquency. And that usually happens, as you might know, when the value is declining to such a great extent that the owner doesn't see it worthwhile to pay property taxes. And sometimes those can go into, they can kind of become public property, acquired by the public. And typically what can happen is you end up seeing short sale, auction, or if the house is kind of in a substandard situation, it can be raised and it becomes a vacant lot. So I want to turn now to discuss how we arrived at this moment by reviewing some of what historian Richard Rothstein sees as the forgotten history. And Richard Rothstein wrote a book, Color of Law, came out in 2017. And it's a book I recommend, and you'll actually see me recommend it later, but it's really informative about the kinds of processes that happened 60, 70, 80 years ago that created both racial residential segregation in the United States, but also has led to different kinds of financial fortunes out of that segregation. So again, Richard Rothstein calls this period of time, and you can see on this cover, there are these redlining maps, the forgotten history of how government systematically disadvantaged people of color through housing and homeownership policies. Before proceeding further, I'd like to conduct another poll about your familiarity with the Homeowners Loan Corporation, also abbreviated HOLC. This is a New Deal policy that helped with birth a process we know as redlining. So Lacey, if we could do another poll, I want to get a sense of your experience with the Homeowners Loan Corporation. How familiar are you with the history of the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which created redlining?
Make sure that you answer this one too. Again, it's required for CE. Dan, do you want me to share the results with everybody when it's done too, so they can see? Sure.
Yeah, that'd be great. That'd be great.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. We'll give it just another couple of seconds here. I'm going to go ahead and end this, and then I will share the results. There you go. Fantastic. You should all be able to see that now.
Yeah, so we've got sort of a bimodal split in the group. There is general unfamiliarity, and people know something about it, with few people knowing a lot about it, at least with this, with the responses reported. So I'll probably delve a little bit deeper into some of that program because it matters a lot to how we can think about some of the creation of and reinforcement of inequalities in people's access to the housing market. And this has a legacy. This has an outsized effect several generations later, and that's important to understand. It's an important kind of thread to pull through from what happened 80 years ago to contemporary situations. And so if you still have questions, we can talk about that. There'll be a moment in about 10 minutes where I'll pause and we can kind of clarify anything that you have. But I'll also be introducing some resources along the way that can be helpful guides to check into. I realized reading a book probably is not something anyone planned on fitting in, but there are other resources too that will be shorter, and it's something that you could refer to if you're interested in knowing more. But also give me some time and maybe I'll satisfy your curiosity. So as you might know, after the Great Depression, I should say maybe in response to the Great Depression, the federal government in the United States created a set of programs in order to jumpstart the economy. There's a flailing national economy. It was badly hurt during the stagflation of the Great Depression. People weren't buying many goods. They weren't investing in houses. Credit had kind of dried up. There's high unemployment and increasing inflation. So people were just hesitant generally. And so there's an effort by the United States government to create a series of programs that would address this. And there are many, but one that I think is important to think about today is that there was an attempt to change the credit and the borrowing market for homeownership, and really in order to broaden people's access to homeownership. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, but what I want to emphasize is the effect that it had here. And so this chart kind of gives you a century look at new housing starts, right? So we're tracking here permits that are pulled in order to construct new housing. And what you can see in this graph is that it kind of bounces around. There's this jump in the roaring 20s. There's this rebound after some of these programs begin. But we don't see it really take off until after 1945 until after World War II. There's a number of reasons for that, partly because the programs that were generated were kind of slow to take root. And then also there was the United States involvement in the war effort in World War II, which ended up creating a number of dampers on the programs. And also, in some cases, there was a moratorium on building because those materials were deemed important in order to support the war effort. So one of the things that we end up seeing here is that the new housing starts really take off after the end of World War II. There is an enormous volume. There's an enormous volume of new housing starts. Just looking at the area under the curve, it is probably 5 to 6 times what preceded it. And it's important to have that trend line in your mind. But I think what it doesn't show is that these starts generally took place outside of central cities in suburban areas. So outside of historic core cities and away from communities of color. I want to get into this program a little bit further. So I want to talk a little bit about some of these programs that created the Homeowners Loan Corporation. Then we'll talk more in depth about the Homeowners Loan Corporation, which is responsible for the process of redlining. We'll talk about what redlining is as well. And so again, just to summarize, in response to the economic crises, the stagflation of the Great Recession, we see that there's a couple of New Deal programs that are really meant to broaden the opportunities that people had in order to enter homeownership. And it also catalyzed so many new housing starts, oftentimes to new housing that were at the periphery of development. Where are all those houses going to go? They're not going to go in already built up areas. They're going to go at the periphery in the greenfield areas, at the fringe of the city, and expand it outwards. So that was really made possible through 2 programs. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, abbreviated as HOLC and sometimes referred to as HOLC, not Hulk, but HOLC. That was established in 1933. And there is some allied programming in the creation of the Federal Housing Authority that provided a lot of financing to ensure that the program could be implemented, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And the point of these programs was to stimulate private home construction in order to kickstart the construction industry. They provided a variety of measures that would broaden the number of people who could access home ownership. So they did that primarily by really transforming the lending market. So the lending market in the United States prior to the Great Depression was different than it is today, as you might know. Typically people, if they would buy housing, they would sometimes need to have down payments of 40 to 50%, and their terms of repayment would be on the order of 5 to 10 years. So a really different kind of equation than what we now know today. And in that situation, few people could come up with the much higher down payment, the upwards of 40% of the purchasing price. So, and then also, many banks were reluctant to lend money out of concern for default, just in the situation that there's rampant unemployment and inflation was worrisome. And so what the New Deal programs did in the Federal Housing Authority is that it provided a new product in the market. And what it said is that it would insure lenders. It would provide some assurance so that if there was, for people who met certain criteria, if there was a default on those loans, that the federal government would absorb the costs of that default. They also changed the repayment period. So typically, if it was 5 to 10 years, that shifted to a 25-year repayment period, and that has increased to up to 30 years now. And they also changed the of upfront costs. So it really diminished from a staggering 40% to as little as 5% down. And later on with the GI Bill, which supported veterans returning from World War II, veterans could actually purchase a house with no money down if you were white. Right? So African-American GIs were not included in that programming. And so what this ended up doing is really broadened the number of people who could access home ownership. And in some ways, this was by design, because one way out of the stagflation of the Great Depression was to get money circulating, to get many people buying new homes, arranging to have new homes purchased, which just injected a lot of capital into a capital-starved situation. And what this did was it directed investment in housing to the periphery of central cities. And I want to note here, and it's a footnote really, but these programs and the New Deal also did send money to central cities, but they took a different form than these new housing starts. Typically, they're focused on projects known as urban renewal, typically raising land and transforming it into an industrial site. They also, in some cases, built stadia and did other kinds of larger capital-intensive works. They also created public housing. So cities were not neglected, but there's different kinds of inputs that they received. And just want to note here that in the previous slide, I mentioned that new home starts generally took place in suburban areas away from communities of color. And this was sanctioned, perhaps orchestrated is a better word, by the Homeowners Loan Corporation. This is a federal program that guided the creation of what are called residential securities maps. Now, these maps inform decisions about where government-backed mortgage lending should go, right? So there's banks are lending money according to certain criteria set out, and there's an attempt to identify where that money should go. So these, and as I said, these maps informed decisions about where that should go. So to be sure, the Homeowners Loan Corporation radically transformed people's ability to access home ownership, and it catalyzed an incredible building boom and paved the way for post-war prosperity. But that access and prosperity was unevenly distributed, and many people of color were left out. And I want to talk a little bit more about why that was. And this was due in large part to the guidance of the residential securities maps that each city created at the direction of the Homeowners Loan Corporation program. The maps graded areas based on their degrees of risk and identified areas worthy of investment or that were deemed too risky for it. So it used a 4-part grading scheme, each with a distinctive color. So here I actually have a historical artifact of the legend for the residential securities map. And I'll show you some examples of these maps in a moment. But what's important to know are the labels or the categories that they were mapping. And so they had these 4 different categories, graded A, B, C, and D. And perhaps what's more telling are the descriptions of these grades. So the best option is really where mortgage lenders were encouraged to make their best and most competitive loans in the highest amount. There are these areas that were in the still desirable category. These are good areas that might be showing some worn edges, but that lenders should still feel some confidence in making loans. And then there's the bottom 2 categories, which were seen as warranting either caution or outright avoidance. And so the areas rated C, termed definitely declining, were in these older neighborhoods that often saw a kind of population turnover. And the hazardous areas, which were noted in the color red, are areas that were in the grips of full decline. And so these were seen as really the opposite of good, really worrisome and risky areas for lending, and ought to be avoided generally. Right? And so the areas with the greatest risk, these hazardous areas, the fourth grade, were often referred to as hazardous. They were red, and hence the term redlining. And just a quick plug for this fantastic website on mapping inequality, which actually catalogs and you can actually interact with and see all of the residential security maps that were, I shouldn't say all of them, many of them that were created in the 1930s. So there is a effort out of the University of Richmond called Mapping Inequality, and it has these interactive site that allows you to explore the HOLC maps and access a trove of historical data and analysis tools. And we can actually use this to think about the legacy and long-term effect of the residential security maps that created redlining. So if you are curious about learning more about redlining, I would actually recommend this site. It's very user-friendly, allows you to explore things. You can see redlining maps for areas that you might be familiar with, and I think that's always, you might have a greater interest in it. And there's also some additional context that can help you appreciate what it is that you're looking at. So we're going to actually look at the residential securities map for Minneapolis. And so this is this grading exercise was run in about 240 different cities around the United States in the 1930s. And we can see what one of the exercises with was in this map for Minneapolis. So here I'm going to focus on one area identified as grade D, so hazardous 3. And it's just basically the near north outside of downtown Minneapolis today. And so we can see one of these hazardous areas was marked as hazardous because of who lived there, as well as the age of the housing and its proximity to industrial activities. As you can note here in bold, right, is that there's this identification of that most of the population is people of color and poor Jewish people. This is actually, there's explicit direction given by the Homeowners Loan Corporation to identify areas as hazardous if it had immigrants, Jewish people, and people of color living in that area. And so there's a really startling pattern that we can see here that recurs throughout the Homeowners Loan Corporation. So areas where racial minorities lived were redlined because that is where racial minorities lived. Their presence was seen by the appraisers, the bankers, the realtors, and the government officials that made these maps as a sure sign of declining value. And perhaps that's one last thing to note about the creation of these residential securities maps. So there's criteria that was universal and decided by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, but they asked each participating city to bring together a community of people who were experts in understanding the real estate market. And so you had people who were realtors, appraisers, mortgage lenders, bankers, government officials, planners, who worked collaboratively to create these maps. Right? And so they're kind of using their local knowledge to translate these areas of low risk to high risk. And one of the things I just pointed out is that there is this racist logic to redlining. And I think this logic is more explicit in the creation, we can see it explicit in the creation of the residential securities map for St. Louis. So this is a map that I actually received from a colleague who is doing archival research on redlining in St. Louis. And so just let me give you some orientation to what it is that we're looking at. So this is a population map from the 1930s. And it specifically is documenting the city's, as they call it, Negro population. If you look at the key here, you can see that it's noting the percent of the total, of the city's total Negro population, the number of people in the census district, they use districts then instead of tracts, and then the percent of the census district, which was comprised by members of the Negro population. And what might be a little bit difficult to see, but if you spend a little bit of time looking at this map, you can. You can see that areas with the largest numbers of people of color, or in this case, the Negro population, they're actually marked in a red grease pencil. You can see some of that here. There's calculations being scrawled on this map and lines being drawn around the census district boundaries. And what my colleague had noted is that these were used in the process of creating the residential securities maps. They were making this decision based on who lived there. And we can see that here in the eventual redlining map of St. Louis. So we'll do real quick just a comparison here. Again, it's a slight change in the scale, but you can see, right, where those areas where in 1930, this map shows the Negro population. And you can also see it correlates with the areas that are redlined. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps worked to restrict access of people of color to federal funding, to the mortgage lending and mortgage refinancing that the Homeowners Loan Corporation and the Federal Housing Authority created in these New Deal programs in the 1930s. So red and yellow lined areas were exposed to more predatory lending practices because people there were often locked out of the federal insured mortgage lending program. And so the summary judgment of these areas as experiencing decline meant that polluting practices were directed to locate in these areas as well. And so you end up seeing landfills locating there. You end up seeing industry being encouraged to locate there, or incinerators locating there. And so this further kind of degraded the attractiveness of red and yellow lined areas. And in fact, it even led to restrictions in municipal services. And again, in St. Louis, Richard Rothstein, in his Color of Law book, talks about this, found that red and yellow lined areas were denied trash services. Like trash service would come irregularly and infrequently. And those areas did not receive infrastructure upgrades like streetlights, sewer maintenance, road maintenance, to the same degree as other places. And they were often the last to receive funding from new schools, if they did at all. And so there's a clear devaluation and disinvestment that these security maps contributed to in cities like St. Louis. Now, it's not true that it happened in every city, but we can document it happening in St. Louis, and there's reason to believe that it happened in other places too. So what we end up seeing is that redlining has created a self-fulfilling prophecy. So Ibram Kendi's best-selling book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, makes the argument that racist policies like redlining are created out of self-interest by powerful people. And then these policies attract racist ideas, which legitimate discriminatory practices that create inequalities and difference that the racist policies seek. In the case of redlining, people of color were denied capital because the powers that be saw them as a high risk for loan default and lacking an interest in reinvesting in property, or just a racist idea that they were unable to keep property in good condition. Now, the mortgage lending that followed the guidance of the Homeowners Loan Corporation security maps ensure that this was the case. Given how these maps influenced people's access to credit, geography was destiny. And decades later, we see that there's a structural difference in the value of property graded best, here, green line on this graph, and the rest. The yellow and red line properties are shockingly lower than the properties that were graded best and even still desirable. Right, so this is the home values nationally coming from Zillow's research group, looking at these properties over about the last 20 years. Right, so we just reviewed a set of processes that created a framework that has endured 70, 80 years later. And I want to actually kind of turn to consider how that affects where we are here in the Twin Cities. And so we're going to have a quick test of your observation skills. Hopefully this will give you another map to look at. Okay. So let's look at how this plays out on the ground. So this is a map of Minneapolis. It's actually rotated 90 degrees so that west is at the top of the map. It's probably a little bit irregular. And you can start to look here at the key for what's being mapped. There's both color and size here in Minneapolis. And the color and size correspond to increases in the taxable value per acre. So this is a way to normalize the value of property. Right, so it's normalized by area. And so size, and then the more purple the color indicates higher values per acre. So this is a map of Minneapolis. Again, it's rotated. And quick, we are going to ask you to identify which areas do you think were redlined. I'll give you 4 to 5 seconds to ponder that. Again, this is value per acre in 2018. Okay, you kind of studied the map, you have your idea. Well, if you identified north and northeast sections, you're right. Again, this is the same map showing value per acre, but it's been joined with the color coding of the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps. And this is an image courtesy of a research group called Urban 3. And so if you got this right, feel free to send me a self-addressed and stamped envelope to my office at McAllister, and I'll in turn send you a valueless prize, but I promise it'll be interesting. You can also see that there's like a depression trench where I-35W ended up running, and where Highway 55 along Hiawatha also ended up running. Okay, let's do this for St. Paul too. Right, so continuing that test. This is a map of St. Paul. It's not rotated, but it also shows value per acre in 2018. Can you identify which areas were redlined? Again, another 4 to 5 seconds to study the map. Got your answers? Okay. Well, Thomasdale, North End, Payne Phelan, you're right. You're also welcome to send me a self-addressed and stamped envelope, and I'll in turn send you a prize acknowledging your achievement on this test. Perhaps unexpectedly, we see some redline areas representing some of the higher values in the city. You can kind of see that outside of the historic downtown of St. Paul and even along the West 7th corridor. These are often cases of repurposing of land, or vacant or abandoned land, or slum clearance in some cases, in favor of more capital intensive projects. And also these areas tend to be more densely built up now, and through a variety of investments such as light rail or policy to create a tourism district. Think about the Xcel Energy Center and the hotels and the built up areas adjacent to it on West 7th. And through these kinds of investments, we can also see why some of these redline areas have higher values, perhaps higher than we might expect. Right? And so let me pause here to see if there are questions that have come up that I might be able to clarify, particularly around the Homeowners Loan Corporation. I realize that was a bit of a crash course on the Homeowners Loan Corporation, and I may have missed something or I may have glossed over something. And so I am happy to answer some questions. I'm going to move out of my presentation to just check in real quick to see. All right, so, all right, Lacey, I don't know if you're seeing stuff on chat. I see the Q&A.
Yeah, on the chat, we had a question: when were non-whites made eligible for the GI Bill?
Yeah, so the GI Bill is a host of different kinds of investments, and it gives people access to a variety of things, including the down payment, the sort of forgiveness for down payment. That specifically wasn't available to African American GIs at the turn of at the end of the war, at the onset of that GI Bill. I can't say specifically when that aspect of the GI Bill changed for Black Americans, but the GI Bill, again, is this constellation of different programs, and there were other kinds of supports that were not exclusive to Black GIs. So I would love to be able to come back and give you a definitive answer on that, but I don't.
Future programming. It looks like there's a few more questions coming into the Q&A. Somebody asked, what do you think will happen with the corridors damaged by riots?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I think what is unclear to me is what the sentiment is for how, it'd be interesting to hear from you folks too, what the sentiment of speculators is about whether it's a safe investment to go in those areas or whether it's not. I have the sense that it's a bit uneven, particularly if we think about Lake Street as one of these corridors. There's at least 4 different Lake Streets that I can think of. That corridor is not the same section to section. And there are some areas that seem kind of resilient and attractive long-term to further investment. And I think there are others where it's a little unclear what will happen. So I think, considering what's going on at Hiawatha and Lake Street right now, I think that location could kind of go either way. The city of Minneapolis has already indicated that it may not rebuild the precinct that was destroyed there. There's pretty extensive destruction at that location. And you had already seen some more tired facilities in the Target that's over there. I could see that that might be a place where it's pretty cool and you're not going to see private investment going there. And the city might need to be a player in order to make it attractive or to assuage concerns in investment. And will the city do that? I don't know. We're also seeing a shift away from the single family zoning model in Minneapolis. It's a little unclear what will happen. So I'm reluctant to make predictions about the future on that area in particular. But I think one of the ideas that are probably useful for thinking about from what we've covered so far in this presentation is that if that area is labeled as risky, that there will end up being a general aversion to investment in that area. And it will be slow, it will be uneven, and it may create situations where some people are pretty vulnerable. That was the GI Bill originally for education. The GI Bill was for returning GIs to support and acknowledge support them in their transition to a peacetime economy and to honor and acknowledge their service. And so there's actually a constellation of different activities. All right, so what role does an employment and education have to obtaining a mortgage? Well, I think in some ways you might know this a bit better than I do, but when it comes to having an application for a mortgage loan, employment clearly matters a lot, and you have to show consistency of a paycheck, and typically, you have to note where your check is coming from, and you have to kind of go back in time, up to 2 years to show what the trend lines are of your income. And employment, it's better for the grading than self-employment. And as far as education goes, I'm less clear on how that might matter in how applicants are scored for getting a loan. But one of the things that there's some general correlations that people who have completed four-year degrees are, all things being equal, more likely to have more stable and increasing incomes over time. This just kind of sets folks up for a bit more economic mobility. But that's an interesting question on the mortgage lending side of, how does someone's biography affect their ability to access credit? That's one that I would like to know more about too, Hugh. Let me take a moment, unless there's other kinds of. Oh, okay. So Stephen is asking if there's another city that mirrors Minneapolis-St. Paul when it comes to race. And that actually is an interesting segue to consider a further case study that I want to share with you. And I think, every city is unique. And there are different kinds of histories that we have to honor when it comes to how general processes like the Homeowners Loan Corporation gets put into practice in specific places. But we can actually see similar processes in this redlining taking place in a variety of cities throughout the United States. The disparities aren't always quite as great here as they are elsewhere, but I'm going to delve deeper into a case study about Kansas City. And interestingly, Kansas City has cities both on the Missouri and the Kansas side, so it's a little bit like a twin. And in that way, there's some superficial comparisons, but we can kind of start to see some of the contemporary impacts of redlining. So, Stephen, thanks for that question. And let me kind of delve into some of the data a bit deeper. All right, so let's return to the presentation. All right, and then Lacey, just making sure you're seeing my slides and not my presenter view.
Everything looks good.
Nice. Thanks for those questions, folks. We'll kind of cruise through to some more content here. So one thing to note is that redlining was part of a constellation of racist policies that created disparities. There are additional practices that help to institutionalize racial separation and disparity. So one is race-restrictive deed covenants, and these emerged more than 2 decades before redlining. They often appeared before the Great Migration of Blacks out of southern cities to northern cities. And you might be familiar with deed covenants from real estate transactions that you may have overseen. These are legal documents that are affixed to the deed that might prescribe certain ways in which the property can be used. I know when I lived in property in Colorado, it was stipulated that I couldn't paint my door certain colors, and that was on the deed covenant. And so and these kind of emerge in all sorts of ways. Well, in beginning, at the turn of the 20th century, we end up seeing that restrictions about the race of the occupants of the house were affixed to deed covenants, particularly in the North. And we can see that is the case in the Twin Cities. And one great resource that we have from the University of Minnesota is the project called Mapping Prejudice. And Mapping Prejudice shows the appearance and spread of these covenants in Hennepin County and provides some examples of how these documents read. So you can actually see the historical artifact itself. And what is interesting to note is that these race-restrictive deed covenants were used in part when redlining decisions were made, or I should say greenlining decisions were made as well. So areas that had race-restrictive deed covenants, there's a greater, that informed people's decisions to greenline them as safe for investment. And what's interesting is that in 1948, there was a Supreme Court decision that called Shelley versus Kramer that determined that race-restrictive deed covenants were unconstitutional and could not be enforced. I have a static image here on the screen, but Mapping Prejudice, Mapping Prejudice, I encourage you to visit. It has this animation and it kind of shows it over time. I'm catching it at the very end. And what we see is actually there are new race-restrictive deed covenants added even after that Supreme Court decision. And so these covenants continued to appear after they were found unconstitutional. Now, these weren't always enforced. And sometimes a person could bring it to court, but that was a really lengthy process. And people they want to buy a house, but they want to live in it. They don't want to maybe buy a house and go and litigate it through a court battle and maybe end up in it in about a year or longer. And so these ended up having an effect by redirecting people to go elsewhere. And so one of the effects of these race-restrictive deed covenants is that it clearly distorted the market for Black home buyers. And even if a realtor was interested in making that sale, any sort of transaction had to say, well, you're going to have to go through the courts to make this official. And one can see very quickly that that sort of transaction has a huge cost to it when many people just want to get on with their lives and buy a home, make it the home base that they want. So there's a lot you can check out in the race-restrictive deed covenants. I encourage you to check it out. So in covenants, they played a role, consequently, in a practice known as steering. And this is where the search for buying a house would be directed to certain locations. And there's a variety of reasons of why that might happen. But often what we end up seeing, particularly in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and 70s and 80s and 90s and aughts and 10s, even today, is that people have been directed to buy in certain areas. And this can have an effect of distorting the housing market for buyers, for home seekers. And so we see that historically, in steering practices, some realtors directed racialized minority buyers away from majority white neighborhoods, as well as neighborhoods that were better rated in the Homeowners Loan Corporation maps. There's a frank discussion of this in a book called Origins of the Urban Crisis, that right now actually my students and I are reading in a course that I'm teaching. So alongside covenants, we see that people of color were and continue to be denied mortgage loans at a higher rate. And this has turned them toward unregulated lending markets that can be quite predatory and leave them in a precarious position. So precarious such that missing a single monthly payment can result in relinquishing their ownership claim outright. So even if someone has paid monthly for 5 years, they miss a payment, it transitions to the lender. So finally, the red line areas are also effectively served, these effectively served as a target for urban renewal and slum clearance programs that were happening kind of in the wake of the New Deal programs to kind of infuse central cities with capital in order to jumpstart the economy there. So in these programs sought to remove blight and revitalize areas by turning land to different uses, such as the construction of an interstate highway through the African-American neighborhood of Rondo in St. Paul. And in case you don't know it, this is, I think, a pretty powerful story that I'll tell in brief. So Rondo was formed as a vibrant African-American neighborhood in St. Paul in the 1950s, and it was a robust mix of single-family homes, parks, shops, restaurants, churches, social clubs. It was a strong urban village. Yet St. Paul powers that be labeled it a slum. And this is actually a map, a historical artifact from a sociologist that was hired by chambers of commerce in both the city of St. Paul the city of Minneapolis in order to do a social inventory of how neighborhoods were being settled, to identify what was called the natural areas of where different kind of ethnic groups were living in the cities. And so what this map sought to do is to give a snapshot of where different social communities were residing. And one of the things that it also ended up doing was marking areas in some ways according to the quality of the built environment. And so what might be a little bit challenging to see in some of these maps, simply because the contrast is low, but you end up seeing that there are areas that are labeled as a slum. Here, there's this area labeled slum, Italians, Jews, Negroes. There's this area that actually where Rondo is, the largest Negro section in the city. And they also identified areas such as the Gold Coast. And this is actually a direct reference to a neighborhood in Chicago, actually, and that's where the sociologist Calvin Schmidt learned to do this. Right? And so we can start to see there's some of this description about the quality of the place, which reflects certain people's sentiment, but also starts to legitimate certain decisions. Right? And one might be able to suppose, although I have no direct connection, that this could also have informed the redlining practices. And we can see here, right, there's the section D4 of St. Paul that overlaps quite closely with the Rondo neighborhood that was on that map from Calvin Schmidt. Now, the St. Paul residential securities map was not finalized until 1937, 2 years after that Calvin Schmidt map. So they are probably in conversation for the people who are making these residential securities maps. And indeed, significant part of Rondo was redlined. So this is a map that is a little bit grainy, but it is a cartographer's attempt to color code and to show how different transportation infrastructure kind of is laid out according to these areas. And so the resolution is a lot better on that black and white map than this. But what I like about this is that you can see where interstate highways were routed. And as you might know, there's an interstate that was routed right through the historic Rondo neighborhood. And so the resulting depreciated market value from redlining also meant that this area was an optimal choice for routing the construction of things like interstates, and Interstate 94 in particular. So this restylized version of Calvin Schmidt's map shows the transportation infrastructure. I think leads to a series of questions. Now, one thing to note is that, if you don't know the history of Rondo, one thing that you should know is that there actually were alternatives considered for the routing of the Interstate 94 through the Rondo, historic Rondo neighborhood. One of the alternatives that was actually looked at quite closely was a northern route, and this actually was cited to go along what is the current day Pierce-Butler route. But Rondo was selected in part because it was seen as less costly and that the political fallout was less complicated. It was unclear about getting access to, or how costly it would be to get access to the land on this northern route, in part because it was owned by railroad companies. And so this ended up disrupting thousands of lives. There's a trench built to host Interstate 94 that took 3, 4, 5 years to complete. So it wasn't a quick transaction where the disruption was limited. People's lives were disrupted directly by having their homes razed, but then also this was routed through community gathering places, places of employment, and it disrupted thousands of lives. It displaced community institutions like social clubs, churches, and corner stores. People were forced to spend savings on moving and resettling. Now, homeowners were frequently not given fair market value for their homes. And the red line status also meant that the fair market value was already lower. And meanwhile, the value of nearby property, just outside of the eventual freeway that was constructed, suffered because of noise and air pollution. So let me kind of get into that case study about Kansas City that Stephen Anderson, you had kind of asked a question about this. So the institutional racism evident in redlining, slum clearance, and interstate siting has an enduring effect today. And we can see that in contemporary value analysis completed by Urban 3. It's an urban planning consulting firm in North Carolina. And they've done some exploratory analysis on the lost value to cities due to redlining. And I just want to give a plug for them. There's a link here that once you get the slides, you can go and click on. They have a super detailed website that kind of walks you through their exploration of Kansas. And I'm just going to show you a few slides in the interest of time. And you know, all credit due to them. They've really done some knockout analysis. But you know, what they ended up doing is they joined the Homeowners Loan Corporation grades to current property values. And they created these maps. You know, we saw a previous version with St. Paul and Minneapolis where we played that game, spot the redlined area. And I'll cover this quickly in the interest of time. But what I want to emphasize here is that there's been a huge amount of value lost. By their calculation, in just a small area of Kansas City, as much as $30 million over 80 years. $30 million in taxes. So they've sought to quantify the cost of redlining, and their findings are striking, suggesting that everybody loses due to redlining, that the greatest burdens fall disproportionately on people of color. So according to research by the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, 65% nationally, 65% of majority minority communities, that they call it, across the US are still in neighborhoods that were redlined in the 1930s. And so what you can see here in this map, just looking at Kansas City, is that there's a clear step kind of construction about the value per acre and this kind of follows along an earlier graph that we saw. The value per acre is much higher in areas that had received green and blue, you know, the better designations, the first and second grade, versus areas that had received the third and fourth grades, the definitely declining and hazardous. So in one neighborhood of Kansas City, it's on the Kansas side, their analysis finds that redlining has caused the city to lose out on an enormous sum of taxes. They found that it's $30 million in taxes over 80 years. That's just for one neighborhood. And think about the good fortune that investment could bring by stabilizing neighborhoods, investing in infrastructure, which would help people find their way onto the wealth escalator of homeownership. And just kind of to give this snapshot in brief, we can take a closer look at the neighborhood that they were looking at on this map. It's right about here, this area that had been redlined. And so we can actually, it's about a square kilometer. And this is what the neighborhood actually looks like. The vacant land properties that are marked here are no longer producing revenue, but all the costs associated with development, like roads and pipes, they're still there costing money. And so here's what that neighborhood looks like today. Oops. And these vacant lots in this area, this kind of square kilometer, they represent a little over 100 acres. There's 732 of them. And we look at their value per acre and the eventual lot price. It's pretty low. And then Urban 3 compares these vacant lots to the surrounding occupied housing. And this ends up being pretty value suppressed at 17,000 a piece here when we look at the occupied lots. But they're kind of comparable, the number of lots and the value and the acres, right? But there's quite a difference in the average lot price. So what's interesting to note is that if these vacant properties were kept from slipping into delinquency and then demolition, they would stay on the tax rolls, right? There might be a structure there, even though it might be modest, there would be a structure there. That would drastically increase revenue, increase tax. And so one of the things that we note is that there's a 40-fold difference between those occupied lots in this historic redline areas and those vacant lots, right, where they kind of slipped into tax delinquency and then were demoed and became vacant lots that are no longer providing tax revenue to the city, but are still costing the city because they have to operate the infrastructure. So, and among the nuggets of information in the old redlining maps, mapping inequality, they're the market values for housing at the time, right, in the 1930s. And Urban 3 wondered what it might have looked like if these houses had survived at these old values. So those 732 lots will be worth $2,000, which adjusted for inflation is $36,000. Still a pretty modest value, but if we multiply that out, it's $30 million. Think about that, right? That's one neighborhood in one city. It's a rough number, but it gives us a scale of what it costs the city governments to redline Black neighborhoods. Quite a difference. Right? And that really everyone is losing out there. So the disinvestment directed by redlining and adjacent kind of racist policies have a cumulative effect on people living in the hazardous and definitely declining areas. It translates into limited and lost opportunities for homeownership and housing mobility. In a raw economic sense, this has stunted the growth of local economies and limited the potential of everyone's prosperity. Right? There's fewer chances to get on the wealth escalator. People are not as able to participate in the housing market as they otherwise could be. Constrained opportunities for ownership. But again, the gravity of these losses is felt most acutely by people of color. Research by the Center for American Progress shows that the median Black borrower at all income levels has experienced housing value depreciation in recent times, whereas their white peers have seen appreciation. So turning our attention to people of color's experience with housing discrimination, there's more discouraging news, but also guidance about what can be done. And I think that kind of relates to the work that you all do. So hopefully you received a handout as part of enrolling in this course, which is my attempt to boil down a 190-page report into 2 pages. And the HUD study that's sort of paraphrased there, is the most recent, rigorous, and comprehensive effort to measure housing discrimination in the rental and homeownership markets nationally. The good news is that there's less evidence of discrimination today compared to previous studies. They're done about every 10 years. But discrimination still persists. And the gist is that Black and Asian home buyers learn about and visit fewer homes than their white and Latinx peers. This may be in part due to less time spent with realtors. And this translates into less information about opportunities to make an offer or to consider a wider set of options. And overall, people of color receive less encouragement and support to buy housing. On its face, this discrepancy seems fixable. And I want to kind of turn to talking about ways to confront institutional racism and consider what to do in the face of problems that I've highlighted. And we'll kind of take this for the last 10 minutes or so. So I think there are a few actually existing efforts worth highlighting, and you might consider how they relate to your own work and the places in which you live and work. So Seattle's Race and Social Justice Initiative has been operating for more than a decade, and it's evolved into a set of tools that can be used to center racial equity in the work of city government and in its regulatory and oversight roles, the way in which it operates with different companies and different organizations in the city. And these tools include ways to align procedures with equity and to be sensitive to racial inequity, historic racial inequity, in order to consider and correct disparate outcomes. Now, the toolkit has been taken up by a wider effort called the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. And they've kind of sought to translate the tools created in Seattle for much wider use outside of city governments, but also wider use outside of Seattle. And so they've started to adapt it for a variety of operations, including individual organizations, special districts, special taxing districts, and county and municipal governments. And there might be something of interest if that's something you'd want to think about for your own practice, for the firms that you might be a part of or lead. But I think it's also important to raise awareness of how institutional racism has worked in the past and its legacy today. It's, I guess, one of the reasons why I gave this presentation. I suppose that's the main part of my talk, the main purpose of my talk with you. But the larger point here is that unless we acknowledge past wrongs and understand how these happened and their impact today, history is destined to be repeated. And that's why efforts like the Rondo Commemorative Plaza, which is a memorial to Rondo and an explication of how it was maliciously targeted for destruction, are important. And it's a place you can actually go and visit, and it's an open-air, outdoor memorial, among other things. It's actually a pretty nice place if you haven't been there. And then efforts like mapping prejudice are also informative because they show in unambiguous ways how racism informed real estate, how it was institutionalized, and how that continues to have an effect today. And then as part of raising awareness, I think it's important to become aware of how our own biases, which we might otherwise overlook or take for granted, may actually be a part of our own conduct. And one tool for this is an implicit bias test. There are a battery of these tests, and many of them are free to take online at Harvard University. And you can see in here, there's a URL listed. You can go, or you can just Google implicit bias, and you'll see your options. So I'm going to conduct one more poll here. And that poll, I'm curious about how many of you have taken an implicit bias test. I only learned about these recently, and so I'd like to know if others have done this too. And I want to remind you that a response is required to receive continuing education credit.
We'll give it another few seconds here, and then I'll share the results as well.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
We're almost there. So for me, it was revealing. There we go, we got 100%. For me, it was revealing because I learned about what I implicitly or unconsciously favor. And this has just given me more information that I can use to act on and be deliberate about being more inclusive and promoting more equitable environments in my teaching, in my interaction with people in the various places that I invest my time. And it's something, it certainly doesn't hurt. No one knows the results of it but you. And it gives really important food for thought. And it's on that I want to spend a little bit more time about. So thinking about your job as realtors or involvement in the real estate industry, I think doing an implicit bias test could be quite helpful for your own practice, or even for tracking whether individual people of color home seekers are given the same degrees of encouragement and support as their white peers. And one of the things that we had noted, right, is that there's 9.6% more time spent with white home buyers. That seems like a very straightforward thing to fix to me, but we're not always conscious of it because we don't track it. And that more time translates into more opportunities for encouragement, more recommendations. And so I think that, though, might sound like a lot to take on, and maybe it is. But without it, disparities will persist and perhaps increase. And I think everyone loses out in that. As Kendi notes in his book, the opposite of racism is anti-racism. There's no such thing in neutrality in this, is what he says. There isn't such thing as non-racist or race neutral. You're either racist or anti-racist, according to his argument. And so he argues that to address racism, the focus should be on policy and promoting anti-racist policy in particular. But this requires support, and it's important to develop an awareness and a mindset that's on guard to racist ideas, and that have become so normalized in our lives that we don't always see them. So things like that implicit bias test can be really helpful. Right? And they're sometimes not evident to us simply because we benefit from them. And so to end here, I want to note, thinking about what can be done. I think thinking about policy is really important, and that kind of follows from Kendi's point as well as Richard Rothstein's point, the color of law. That supporting enforcement for fair housing programs ends up being really important. And we have tools to monitor bank lending. They actually are in operation, but the differential access to mortgage lending actually continues. So there might be new policy that's necessary, or just supporting efforts that provide credit and lending to communities of color. And also just encouraging processes that are thinking about racial disparities and centering racial equity in housing. Thinking about the communities where you are, promoting awareness of past and current racism in the housing market. Talk to a colleague, talk to a family member about redlining and thinking about the legacy of redlining. Study the security maps so that you're aware of it as you are out doing your work, becoming familiar with the places where you're active. Urge professional associations or firms that you work with to advocate for anti-racist policies. Then you might even think about your own practice. Understand personal implicit bias, form a strategy to counter it. One of the things that Kendi says is that, to be anti-racist is like fighting an addiction. It requires persistent self-awareness, constant self-criticism, and regular self-examination. And that's something that seems worth doing. And if you want more, there certainly are these resources that I would recommend. Again, these are links that you can click on. So in the PDF that you end up getting, you should be able to link to those. And these are all ones that I think are certainly worthwhile. They find their way into the courses that I teach. And I would think that it's time well spent on any one of these, if not all of them. So thanks for your attention today. Thanks for your questions. And I'd be happy to engage in any follow-up questions, although I think we're at time. I'd welcome an email. And again, if you want to claim your not so fabulous prizes for participating in the Spot the Redlined area, I'd love to hear from you.
Sounds good. Dan, if you're okay with it, we'll provide that information in our follow-up email with the link to the recording and handouts. And again, for attendees that are here, last question to answer is, did you learn something new today? We certainly hope so. Thank you again, Professor Trudeau, for taking the time to work with MAR to get a course that is relevant to our members and to the housing industry. You guys are all free to go for the afternoon. I will follow up with getting your CE uploaded within 10 business days. If for some reason there was an issue with polling, we will also reach out and let you know. Otherwise, thank you again for coming and have a wonderful afternoon. We do actually ask one more thing. If you could take the survey on your way out, you'll be directed to it right away when you leave the webinar today. So thank you again for attending.
Thanks, folks.